The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Hi, welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other fields of study and how they connect to Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer and I write for Star Wars Insider Magazine, StarWars.com, and I'm the author of Star Wars crossword puzzles and other word games from a galaxy far, far away.
And I'm your other co-host, Melissa Miller. I'm a scientist and science writer. I do also freelance for Star Wars Insider Magazine. On this episode, Star Warsologies is going to chat about galactic cartography. Our guest expert today is Jason Fry, author or co-author of over 40 Star Wars books. From reference guides like the Essential Atlas and Star Wars Timelines to middle-grade fiction like the Rebels, Servants of the Empire series, and also the adult novelization of The Last Jedi. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, good to see you, Jason.
Nice to see you all.
I know it's not what's true or whatever, but somehow saying the adult novelization of The Last Jedi seemed a little suggestive.
Yeah. Tons of banned content. The great thing is, the junior one is by my friend Mike Kogi, and it's terrific.
I feel like now I want to read them both actually and really understand like what goes into each one.
He's a scene with Luke and R2 that I'm so jealous of. I'm like, I wish I'd thought of that. It's amazing.
Awesome. Never too late for more Last Jedi content as far as I'm concerned. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I guess your Star Wars story might be sort of a long, epic, scrolling one, but can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Star Wars before it was part of your profession and then how it sort of led to that?
Sure. Yeah, I was 8 years old when the New Hope came out. So I like to say that I date back to a world before Star Wars, which is kind of incomprehensible to more and more people. But it was pretty remarkable to try to recreate that a little bit. I was 8 years old, and suddenly there was this movie out there that everyone you knew in the entire world saw. Not just kids who like comic books and stuff, but like your grumpy neighbor down the street and your aunt and uncle and just everyone. And it was just this kind of mass culture phenomenon that I'd never seen anything like it. But for me, I was a kid who already loved storytelling and sci-fi and fantasy and everything else. And I was already kind of on some level dreaming of telling my own stories, but I'd never imagined there could be stories like that. I like to say by the time I saw, the engines of Darth Vader's Star Destroyer in that first shot, like I knew my life was different. From that moment on, I just loved Star Wars and happened to be lucky enough to continue writing and have my fandom and my, writing as a career actually eventually intersect and get to add something to this amazing galaxy far, far away, which has been an enormous privilege and a lot of fun.
Yeah, you've definitely, contributed probably to a whole generation of Star Wars fans. You've written a lot, both in the old expanded universe and in the current canon, including one of my favorite short stories that you wrote was a Hondo Ohnaka story.
Oh, yeah. Hondo Ohnaka's Not So Big Score. Oh, bless you for remembering that one. Yeah, that was super fun. It was also kind of a huge risk. It was trying to be funny in Star Wars, which I love Star Wars fiction, but, sometimes the weight of that responsibility, like it forgets to be funny. But that one was just, trying all out to do like kind of a British kind of drawing room comedy / slapstick story. It worked for at least one reader, which makes me super happy.
Well, as a proud leader of Team Hondo, I was very impressed.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
Anyway, we're here to talk about galactic cartography.
Very different.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about, what does cartography mean? Quick definition maybe, and then how it applies to your work in Star Wars.
Well, cartography is really the science of maps and plotting things on maps. And it's another thing that I've been interested in from the very beginning. And unlike my other interest in the Star Wars storytelling, though, it was a little harder to figure out how to make that work. But I'll take you way back. I loved two books as a geeky kid. I loved The Atlas of Middle-earth by Karen Wynne Fonstad, where she, took this incredible kind of rigor, both in kind of timelining and chronology, but also in geology and botany and everything else, and did these incredibly detailed maps of Middle-earth that were really designed to just kind of add all this kind of amazing detail. And I just loved that book, both because it let me geek out about Tolkien, which I was a huge fan of, but it also taught me something really important as a eventually one day to be kind of lore author, that you could bring this sort of academic rigor to an imaginary place. And that wasn't necessarily strange. I mean, it is kind of strange if you think about it, but you could do it and people would value that. And that was a really interesting lesson. So that was one. There was also this great book called The Atlas of Medieval History by a guy named Colin McGevity, who's a really interesting guy. He was like he was just this self-taught English historian. And the way he wrote history books was they were a sequence of maps, typically like, the outline of Europe, and then you'd see it advance 10, 20, 30 years at a time. And that was amazing to me because it was kind of visual storytelling, like watching empires advance and contract and countries emerge and vanish and recombine and all that. And that was something else that really stuck with me. And I kind of wanted that for Star Wars, but there's a couple of problems there. I mean, you don't have a Europe to map. You just have a spiral galaxy and a bunch of dots and some lines. So like the mapping is intrinsically harder with that. So that was an interesting challenge. The more fundamental thing though was there wasn't at that time a map of the Star Wars galaxy. In fact, there wasn't until I want to say like the mid 90s, if I'm remembering it correctly. But that didn't stop me. I actually, as a kid, dreamt that there was such a book. I think it was the Atlas of the Star Wars Galaxy was the way I imagined it. And I had one of those dreams, I was probably about 13 years old, where I dreamt I had been at like the mall bookstore and bought this book. And I woke up and didn't quite remember what was the dream and what was reality. And so I was going through like my 7th grader day, like, I'm going to go to school and I have, cross country practice or something. But I was like, that's okay, because at the end of all that, I'm going to come home and I get to geek out with my new book. And then I realized I was just crushed. I realized there is no such book. You just dreamt it. It doesn't actually exist. Well, eventually it did exist. I just had to grow up, actually manage to be an author, convince Lucasfilm and Del Rey to do this crazy book and make it a reality, meet my friend Dan Wallace, the other biggest, I think, Star Wars map dork in the universe. And then we had to write this actually really crushingly hard book. But eventually we did it. That was the Essential Atlas. So I can say with no exaggeration that book was literally a dream come true. It just, 25 or whatever it was years.
I love that level of manifestation, and also thinking about what kids went to the mall and bought that book, and did have the best day ever once they had it in their hands.
Yeah. So my best day ever eventually was, author copies. It would finally arrive. But, hey, it worked. However you get there, right?
Yeah. And you got paid for it. So, big score.
And I got paid for it. There's actually a hilarious story there. So the Essential Atlas, I think, God, it was like more than 2 years from starting to when that book came out, which is a really, really long timeline for a Star Wars book. Like, it doesn't generally work that way. And the reason was we got stuck behind the Star Wars Encyclopedia, the Great Steve Sansweet project that kept growing additional volumes, et cetera. And so we kept getting put back for production reasons. But Dan and I didn't care because we just kept adding more geeky stuff and kept going and going and going. But I once figured out, like, I was a fairly new independent writer too. And I once figured out conservatively how many hours I'd put into the Essential Atlas. And for what I got paid, honestly, like anything other job would have paid better. I mean, I probably got 8 cents an hour when all was said and done. But of course I didn't care at all because what I really wanted was for that book to be a reality. So terrible object lesson for freelance writers, but yeah, it made me perfectly happy.
I think as freelance writers, we sort of all have that scale in our head, right? Of like, don't do the math on how much per hour, because that just leads to you having to justify, well, but I loved it, but it was a dream come through.
There's the books that have to make their money. And then there's the books where, honestly, you don't tell anybody, but you'd actually pay money to make them exist.
Right.
So just don't get the two confused.
Right.
All right. So how do you go about making a map of a fictional galaxy where things aren't really said at all in the source material other than a few vague, this is the outer rim, this is the center of the galaxy?
Well, for the Star Wars Galaxy, I luckily had a head start. That had been done to a certain extent by the time we got there. is Hayden Blackman and Vince Lee. I think were the original map makers on the Behind the Magic CD-ROM, if anyone remembers that, which was a very simplified galaxy map, but it was there. And then it was Dan Wallace, working with Jim Lucino, who really laid down the kind of essentials of what would become the galaxy map. And that was put together for New Jedi Order. You may remember, like, Vector Prime had this thing called kind of the pirate map because it looked, like a pirate treasure map, and it was kind of tilted at this interesting angle. But Jim and Dan did a lot of that hard work, and the way they did it was they figured out trade routes were really the key. Like, if you knew the big trade routes of the galaxy and figured out how they fit together and then the key planets, the rest would kind of fall into place and help determine things. So fortunately, they did that work. And then from then, it's really interesting. Like, it would vary kind of author by author and story by story. Sometimes you'd have information you could use. Other times you just had to go by clues in the text. Like, what's the travel time between these two places? What is the purpose of this planet? If it's a frontier outpost, it's not going to be next to Coruscant. You know that much. You can be like positively placing something, or you can be like figuring out where it can't be. And a lot of it would be honestly just feel. Reading the story, what does this place feel like? Is it somewhere like, kind of in the brambles and bushes that people don't go to in the galaxy? Is it a cosmopolitan trade world with lots of different alien species, et cetera? So when Dan and I, at the end of the Atlas, we still have these hundreds, if not thousands of worlds from Star Wars Storytelling that have never been placed, and we wanted to place all of them for the kind of grid guide at the back of the Atlas. Eventually, we just worked through the list of everything we hadn't placed, kind of going source by source and figuring things out like that. It was an enormous amount of fun. And something I still do today. I track that stuff for Lucasfilm with their looking over my shoulder, of course, and, saying things are okay or need some more thinking or holding off on something like that. So, yeah, so all those kind of Atlas skills are still being employed today.
Okay, yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If you're watching, reading, everything, because maybe some writer just, wants to set something on a new planet, so mentions that, does that lead you to be like, wait, no? I'm curious if if they're checking in on the Atlas and sort of using that for any new worlds, or if it's kind of something that then has to be worked in the other way around.
It depends on the author, which, honestly is fine. As an author myself, the most important thing here is the storytelling, not shackling yourself with like, how do I make this work on the map? Because, honestly, we can make most everything work. And then there are authors who, are actually pretty fantastic cartographers in their own, and that's great. But yeah, for me, like, finding new places makes me hugely excited. If there's a world we haven't seen before, that's great. Figuring out where it goes and making the galaxy literally bigger and richer.
Cool. I'm trying to think of like times we've actually seen maps, or especially the unmapped ones, right? Camino being that fun gravitational anomaly, and in Skeleton Crew, right, at Atten.
Skeleton Crew was so much fun because it was literally there. They had grid coordinates, down to decimal places for some of these places. And I was like, well, that one's not going to be hard to place. I know exactly where that is. But yeah, that was a blast. Having maps and finding places, like being at the center of a story, that was fantastic.
Yeah, it's my favorite recent Star Wars for sure. And not, because it really was pirate. They gave it that whole Amblin Entertainment feel, I think, on purpose. And as a child of the 80s, definitely came across riding bikes in the wood, finding treasure maps and all of that. So I'm glad to know that also fit into your geekiness.
Oh, yeah.
So, obviously most of these books are 2D things. How do you work on kind of squishing a 3D galaxy into a 2D space?
Honestly, we mostly ask forgiveness. Yes, there should be a Z-axis. There should be that component to the galaxy. And there are some worlds out there with Z coordinates. But it generally kind of goes by the wayside. We actually looked at it for the Essential Atlas. And I think there's an edge-on view, for instance, of Endor in the Model sector, if I remember correctly, showing that, there's stuff kind of above other stuff. But for the most part, we threw up our hands. It was honestly just too hard. And so we kind of say, yeah, that's a factor, but for the most part, we're going to leave it out, particularly in the 2D representations. That is a dream of mine. Like, I'm sure there will be stories out there that deal with something being like way above or below the galactic plane and that being important to the story. And that'll be fantastic. in a way, I think Ahsoka's a little bit like that. I mean, we're going to another galaxy. How do you get there, et cetera? So yeah, some great storytelling possibilities there.
Yeah. Now I would really like there to be like an experience, at a celebration or something like that, like a walk-in, because I do want that sort of Force Awakens, the map that you're like inside of. BB-8 projects it for you and you can see the Z-axis. That's a thing that we could actually do with like, a little mini dome or something.
We certainly could. I would love it. And if we get there, we will tackle all those Z coordinates and make them work.
Right.
Yeah, that Camino is being south of the Rishi Maze. I'm assuming that's like south of the galactic plane?
That's a good question. I think if I remember correctly, which I may not, in which case, get on Blue Sky and wag your finger at me. I think the Rishi Maze is actually kind of above the galaxy and Camino's kind of hanging out a little below it. Okay. But I could be wrong about that. If we get there, we'll figure it out.
Well, I was going to say, you just turn the galaxy upside down and then you're right if it's the other way around.
We've touched on it a little bit briefly here, just talking about the 3D and the missing pieces and stuff like that. But, we've seen how maps work of the galaxy in Ahsoka, in Attack of the Clones. What do you make of that? Is that fun to see? Is that like frustrating because you can't do the same thing here on our planet?
I guess I take the long view. I mean, I've gone from literally dreaming of a book that didn't exist with no idea how to get there to taking thousands and thousands of star systems and actually getting them on a map in a way that mostly makes sense. That's already kind of so amazing to me that it actually happened that, I'm pretty happy with that. But the idea that we could do more, like a truly interactive map you could fly through, I mean, that's wonderful tomorrow. Let's get there. Till we do, this is already pretty fun.
Yeah, but those are fun volume days, right? When they're filming those sorts of things. I feel like in Ahsoka or whatever, when they're like sort of in the map and stuff like that, that would be a real fun day.
Yeah, and those end credits, I mean, I just love that. It's fantastic. Yeah.
Those are kind of in universe. How do you think they map the galaxy in the Star Wars universe? We see like in Skeleton Crew that they talk about coordinates and stuff, but how do you think they view the universe as a mappable place?
It's interesting. I mean, in universe and out of universe it's an interesting thing in terms of storytelling because in universe is really kind of a handy way of future-proofing other stories and leaving room for ambiguity and things you don't know, etc. Think about the Clone Wars when all we knew was like the one line from Obi-Wan on Tatooine. A truly out of universe history of the Star Wars galaxy would have been really frustrating because the Clone Wars would be like, it was really big and important. We don't know anything about it. That's really frustrating. So in universe is much better because it kind of covers for that. The interesting thing though is the one kind of creeps into the other. So in universe is very handy for that, but then the out of universe stuff seems to inevitably creep in. Do people in the Star Wars galaxy use the grid system that really ultimately came from West End Games in their own galaxy? Well, apparently they do because we've seen it. I'm pretty sure there's been, references to like the grid stuff from the Atlas maps, here and there. On the other hand though, how else would you do it? I mean, it's a pretty logical way to, if you've got a really big space, you put a grid on it, you figure out where things are, and it makes it much easier to find things. So I think it's very plausible that, hey, at least one civilization out there in the galaxy would have done it. So why not?
Well, now I'm just imagining some of the other ways. In Star Trek, we have those Klingon maps that use kind of triangles and stuff instead of a square grid.
Right.
Not sure how that works, but the Klingons make it work.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. No, the grid is hard enough. Like, yeah, if somebody wants to turn it into like a conic projection or whatever. Like, I think I'd be like, oh, that's cool. Like my brain's going to break. It's interesting. We have brought some of that in for the galaxy map that's up on StarWars.com with the accompanying appendix. Like for that, we made a decision. We had a bunch of worlds that had incomplete coordinates. Instead of a grid reference, there was just a bunch of little question marks. We actually took those out. We weren't saying they didn't exist anymore, but we moved them to something called unlisted. Similarly, there were, a bunch of planets that were really pretty obviously code names within the names of rebel bases, et cetera. And, we took those out because we were thinking like, if a citizen of the galaxy couldn't look something up that way, like, let's not include it here. So there's an example of kind of in-universe and out-universe doing some interesting things and taking some interesting turns.
I'm looking at some of the images from the Atlas. We talk about, Coruscant, obviously we talk about being core world. There's the inner rim, the outer rim. But can we get into some of these terms? Because there's a whole lot more than I even really realized. Hut space. James, I'm sure you knew about all of these already, but...
I don't know. One of the things that made me think a little bit is they talk about, sectors and systems, and it's like, how big is a sector and what are sectors?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one too, because that has changed over time. There was a West End Games definition of sector, which I don't remember how many worlds were in it, but it was really, really small. And you did the math, and that was tens of thousands of sectors in the galaxy. And then in the prequel era, we got a little over 1,000. So that was an interesting example of trying to just square that. Star Wars always finds a way. The answer became the West End Games sectors become subsectors, and most of them belong to larger sectors, and kind of on we go. And then systems. Another thing that's interesting about the galaxy map and the atlas, et cetera, is we made the decision to really work at the star system level, not at the individual planet level, just because, you can see why. If you have so many planets, let alone moons, et cetera, in a system, the task becomes exponentially larger. But that leads to some interesting issues you may not have thought of. People have written to me and be like, where's Trandosha? And I'm like, well, it's the same system as Kashyyyk, and we listed one, so we went with Kashyyyk. We figured that's what people would be most likely to know. So, yeah, there's always kind of interesting issues like that to deal with, and you kind of try to figure out what makes the most sense and go from there.
You wonder if under the Empire they're like, oh no, we're going to write out the Kashyyyk system and call it the Trandosha system in a little Gulf of America thing here.
Yeah, no, it's not a hypothetical. There's in Mask of Fear, which is a great book, by the way, for anyone who hasn't read it. In Mask of Fear, there's an example of a system named after some ancient Jedi that the Empire's renamed. And, for me, that was a really interesting one because we had the old name, and Alex Freed doesn't specify the new name. So I was like, what do we do with that? I'm like, well, I'm not going to list the old name in the appendix because people wouldn't know it. So, yeah, it's right there. What is the new name? I don't know. Maybe some future story will tell us.
That's really interesting. Goes into our anti-fascism episode that we had recently too, of people renaming things for historical erasure. That's interesting. I had no idea. This is fun. I gotta pull myself back out of the map. I can't look at this all right now, but.
One of my favorite Star Wars experiences ever. Dan and I knew there was one of the huge challenges for that book was we had to get a designer to make all these maps. And we found this guy online named Modi who had done these really pretty great maps. And we knew just by looking at them that he shared our sensibility. He was really rigorous about figuring out where things went. And so we approached him and said, this is what we're doing. We wonder if you'd like to do draft maps for us. Do maps like the ones you've created, and then, we're going to find a designer through Del Rey, and we'll turn them over to that person, and they'll redo them in whatever style Del Rey wants. And Modi said, yeah, I'd love to do that, but I'm really embarrassed you've been looking at those maps because I don't think they're very good. I've gotten so much better. And we were like, oh, really? Well, yeah, and send us something in the new style. And he sent back these maps that were just gorgeous and actually looked like starfields and were just perfect. And we were like, these are fantastic. And we realized, well, we don't actually need a designer to go back over them if they look like this. So we went to, Del Rey and Lucasfilm and we're like, here's what's going on. And so we actually then came to Modi and said, would you like to do the actual maps? And he said, sure, but there's one thing you got to know. And we're like, what's that? And he's like, well, I'm 16 and live I think he lived in the Czech Republic. And we were like, okay, that's a thing. Let's go talk to people. And to their infinite credit, first Lucasfilm and then also Del Rey were like, well, is he the right person to make the maps? And we were like, yeah, 100%. We're not going to find anyone like him. And then they were like, well, okay, let's make it work. And so we did. But it led to some kind of amazing things with that book. Occasionally we'd get to a point where we'd be like, well, we're not going to have these 5 maps for a while because Modi has a calculus final coming up. But hey, it worked out.
That's amazing.
That's really cool. It's just proof that if you're into Star Wars, it doesn't really matter who you are, that you can get into a bigger part of it than you'd ever imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that was Good Day Alice came out in 2008. So it was a real lesson in what was starting to be possible in collaboration like that. Dan and I never met till the book was done. And, neither of us has ever met Modi, who did these kind of incredible maps. But yeah, it all worked.
Well, you mentioned pulling from, obviously I'm assuming movies, books, video games. It sounds like that. Like, what other sources of this information are available that you pulled from?
Anything. If there was a Star Wars story out there with a star system in it, we tried to make sure it was included. That included like little mini games. Like there was this Super Nintendo something game with like doing quests for Yoda.
Oh, Yoda Stories.
Yoda Stories. There we go.
I had the demo for that on my PC. It was fun.
Yeah. Choose Your Adventure books. There was this UK only set of Choose Your Adventure stories that I bought in the era when you bought stuff off news groups. I sent like an international cashier's check to the UK. And that book arrived, the package had torn on 3 corners and it was just barely holding in there. I was like one postal worker maneuver away from getting an empty package. But that thing had like 25 stories in it. When Dan and I put together the entire appendix for the Alice, we knew we didn't have everything and we were curious how many we'd missed. And I was like, I bet we'd missed like 24. I was really kind of mad it was that high, but I also thought that was pretty good. But no, we'd missed hundreds, which wasn't a reflection on our being bad at this. We were pretty good at it. It was just, it's so vast. And that's still proving true. Just for preparing for the next Galaxy map and appendix, we found a couple of really ancient things that had just been missed, including this kind of plastic computer game in like 1979, kind of like the old Battleship thing. Mm-hmm. Where you're, facing off against somebody. And in the little instruction booklet for that, there was this tiny bit of storytelling, this planet called Magna that nobody had ever found before, but we'll get it in the next appendix. So great. Just anything can be out there. And I'm sure there's ones we still haven't found, but
that sounds really, really obscure, but now it makes you wonder, what did the Magna Guards have to do with that place?
Future storytelling. Who knows?
There we go.
That's wild. So I assume you learned about the hundreds that were missed because people let you know online.
Oh yeah. No, I've had enormous help from a bunch of dedicated Wikipedians and just folks who are interested. But that's great. They email me, say, hey, how about this? Or, I think you might have gotten this wrong. And we look and, if we did, we take care of it in a future iteration. So 10,000 people will always be more effective than 1 or 2 or 5 at finding these things.
Sounds very much that your maps on StarWars.com and such are a very living document that you're constantly adding to it, you're making corrections to it. How does that work in terms of, oh my gosh, I have to keep working on this? How much time does it take to keep it alive?
A lot, but if you take it kind of story by story, then you stay ahead of it. And there's a joy to it anyway, frankly. If your brain is as twisted as mine, I suppose. Yeah, it was very funny. After we got the new Galaxy map out there in June, with the appendix, somebody on Blue Sky was like, I'm just picturing the poor Lucasfilm employee who bursts into tears every time there's like a new TV show. I was like, well, that's actually me. No, I'm not actually a Lucasfilm employee, but the good thing is
tears of joy.
This is the life I chose. And tears of joy.
That's definitely what I was picturing too, right? Do they give you a heads up or are you just like watching Disney Plus and being like, well, I guess I better write that down?
Yeah, it depends on the thing. Like sometimes they'll come to me about, where should this go or does this look right? But for other things, no, I find out when everybody else does. And, honestly, the latter can be more fun. I loved watching Skeleton Crew unfold and being like, oh, wow, hey, I know how to make that work. Or, oh, where's that? One thing we have learned in the process has been interesting, though, is we've learned that it's better to wait sometimes. And we've gotten better at identifying where storytelling is still moving and kind of holding off on things. So, some of the key worlds in like High Republic, you could tell the storytelling was still moving. It was better to kind of take your hands off and let that unfold. Similarly for TV, if somebody wants to go back somewhere, the last thing you want to do is to, by over defining things, wind up tying somebody's hands.
Yeah, you don't want to box them in when they're like, nope, I'm going this way with this. I'm locating this over here. And you're like, but we put it over here. It's like,
exactly. And there's an interesting push and pull to that. Like, I mean, you can take that too far and you never define anything, in which case, you've lost a way for fans to really enjoy digging in with storytelling and, for things like maps to suggest their own stories, which is great. But yeah, you overdo it and you box somebody in. So yeah, that's an interesting kind of moving target to figure out.
It's fun to hear. I mean, obviously James and I are really into diving deep into things and defining them and figuring out how they would work sort of in the real world. But yeah, it always does come back to like what serves the story. There's so many people playing in this sandbox or whatever. So it's good to know it's flexible in that regard too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, my feeling about the maps is my feeling about all lore writing in Star Wars, which I've been lucky enough to do a lot of. The idea of these books should be to remind you of stories you loved or, kind of alert you to stories you haven't read that it sounds like you'd love, and to have people enjoy your book and then, or you're looking at your map or whatever it is and put that down and like go off and run out and watch a Star Wars. I mean, that's what should happen.
With your work on books like Complete Locations, instead of just doing galactic maps, you're working on maps of planets and worlds. Mm-hmm. What is it like to kind of put those together and say, hey, this is where everything is located on Tatooine, or this is the flight route of the Falcon on Jakku?
Obviously, you're working on a much kind of tighter focus scale. I'd say that's the biggest thing. For the latest Complete Locations, like the one I really enjoyed was doing the Corellia chase from Solo. If that movie was still on tape, I would have worn through it, like pausing it and fast forwarding and all that. So lots and lots of looking and figuring stuff out and looking at deleted scenes and trying to make things match up. The thing that's interesting about things like that is how it's evolved over time, though. For the Solo chase, we actually had kind of previs stuff that had been put together for the movie, where they had imagined, this was what Corellia looked like and this was the route that they would take. So that was there and a huge help. Back in, say, the prequel era, that probably wouldn't have been available to a publishing project like that. It just wasn't the way things worked. But then, of course, you also have to look and say, if you have, say, a previs for a movie, when you actually make the movie, like nobody's going to update the kind of blueprint, because why would you? I mean, the whole point was to let you do the movie and you've done the movie. So you've got to look at how things change and just kind of do some detective work. And then, where you have to fudge things or cut corners, as it were, you're just working in service of the story, as always. And then you get to layer in things like Easter eggs. Like that was a lot of fun for that one. Everything from, High Republic references to like geeky nods to Legends to, I snuck in a couple of American Graffiti references because why wouldn't you?
Great. I love that.
What are some of those other Easter eggs maybe that you've put in there or that you've discovered and been like, that's a really awesome thing?
Well, I mean, one thing that is kind of fun is sometimes there are worlds that haven't been named that you get a chance to name because it's really crying out for one. That's always fun to do. For me, back in the days of the Essential Atlas, the ones I was really happy to do were planets from the Brian Daley Han Solo books. Like Han Solo at Star's End is still my favorite Star Wars book. And, to get to name a planet for that hadn't been named the first time, that was fantastic. That felt like such a gift that you'd been given. One thing I do really love is again, using maps to suggest stories. So, as we were populating the galaxy, like there's an area kind of out in the mid-rim as you're heading out to the outer rim. I want to say it's along the Perlemian, but I may be getting that wrong, so don't quote me on that, where there were already a bunch of kind of separatist industrial worlds. And so once you had that was a really interesting place to put more of them. And then you have like, the kind of cradle of the Confederacy there. We didn't really go out of our way to call it out, but, someone paying attention, there's some interesting storytelling there to pick up on. And some later authors have done that, which is great. We put a bunch of really rebellious, militaristic rebel worlds like out on the galactic fringe near a place called Virgilia. And, that showed up in Last Jedi eventually, like with ships that were donated to the cause by the Virgilians, etc. So
right. Like the Ninka.
So anytime you can do something like that, that's really fun, even if it's something that doesn't get picked up on for years or maybe even not at all.
So one of the other things that's not quite an Easter egg, but that you and Dan are in the Essential Atlas. Tell us about how that came to be and who you are in there.
Yeah, Dan Wallace and I are in the Essential Atlas, which was super fun and not something we expected. We were at Comic-Con. I want to say it was maybe even the first Comic-Con I'd ever been to. Chris Travis just took a picture of us and, kind of posed us. And then before we knew it, we were actually Galactic Scouts in the book. Travis, too, it was very kind of him. I had as much hair then as I do now, but, I have these like cool space goggles on my head, which hides the vast expanse of my forehead, which was really kind of him. It's very funny, though. Two things. First of all, it took me an embarrassingly long amount of time to realize that should be like my social media avatar. I don't know why that was so tough for me. Obviously, that's what it should be. So that was super fun. And there are fans who were like indignant that those characters haven't been named, that were like unnamed Hyperspace Scout number 2. And I was like,
what? They don't have names?
No, they've never been named. But I'm like, Chris freaking Travis drew my portrait. Like, who wants more than that? I'm happy. I don't need to name that guy.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. I love that.
Have you ever had just this idea, like you mentioned, kind of this little cradle of separatist worlds? There's just some spot where you're just going to write, "Here be dragons."
Well, particularly with the unknown regions in Star Wars, which are exactly that. They're like, the Atlantic for Spanish explorers back in the day or something like that. Like, I've always thought they should put Purgles out there and, and whatever the terrifying thing from Solo is.
Yeah,
They should absolutely be on the map like that.
Yeah, so I was actually just thinking, I was like, is the Sum of Verminoth on the map?
Yeah,
because that was clearly
Star Wars Dragon. Do it.
Because I have a globe and I have a map up I'm an oceanographer in my real life. The map at least doesn't, but the globe that I have absolutely is the old timey with like random little, sea serpents and stuff like that sticking out of the ocean here and there.
Those terrifying medieval dolphins that look nothing like dolphins. And,
yes.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's
exactly.
Great.
Some sea goats, I think. Yeah. So that would actually be really fun to see some versions of when there was just unexplored, the travel wasn't between worlds or something like that. Yeah. What the maps would have looked like then, or, I'm thinking of all the various technology maybe that was used too, right? Like, don't we use lasers to figure out how far away the moon is? What were they using in Star Wars?
Yeah, no, it's funny. That's another thing talking about things we didn't do in the Atlas is also kind of fun, just because, it reveals what a long, strange trip that book was. One of my original ideas, which was simultaneously a great idea and a terrible idea, was I was like, the stars in the galaxy are moving around and around the galactic disk, and at various speeds too. So at one point, because we were covering thousands and thousands of years, I wanted the planet placements to be different at different times.
Yeah.
Which, Dan, who's much smarter than me and always kind of keeps me in check, got me to see that was kind of a cool idea, but it would make for an impossible to use book.
Right.
This was already kind of quite a concept to hit readers with, but now you're asking them to deal with like stellar drift. It was like, no.
Right.
Let's not do that. Like, Coruscant's in the same place. Leave it alone.
25,000 years on a galactic scale really isn't that much.
That's the other thing I discovered, that, when I looked at the science, I was like, nah, it's not long enough. You can stop worrying.
I don't know though, because this is something I only learned a few years ago or whatever, is that what we call the North Star wasn't what they used as the North Star in the times they were building the pyramids or whatever. So like, it does happen on, a couple thousand year scale. And that blew my mind. Yeah, no, I'm sort of on your side. I understand that like, that just makes more work for yourself. And how would you even do that? You need that once we get into that 3-dimensional version of it, maybe. But yeah, it's the same thing with scientists now predicting eclipses in, 4,000 years. It's like the math is all there. It can be done, but maybe it doesn't need to be for Star Wars.
Well, I'm just thinking like those, time-lapse maps of like Pangea breaking apart into separate continents. It's like, that's on a pretty big scale that, 25,000, years there is really nothing. And yeah, the North Star does kind of rotate every 20,000 years between 4 stars, but that's just looking at it as opposed to like spinning across any section of the galaxy.
Yeah.
We have done some things that have been pretty fun though. Like there's a map for in the Acolyte visual guide based on the, hopefully now standard map that started at Celebration and is now on StarWars.com. And, I realized something. So you have the Shatta Nebula in kind of modern day Star Wars, which is the remnants of Shatta B. Borin, where in Attack of the Clones deleted scenes, like Padme talks about trying to save its people. So, that went from the Shatta Nebula back to Shatta B. Borin, because in the High Republic era, well, the planet's still there. So, little fun things like that are nice to take into account. Though we've kept Alderaan as Alderaan, partially because, eventually it just gets bizarre. And also there's other places in the Alderaan system, and, they probably don't want to be reduced to, we're not just stellar dust. Like, come on.
Right. Yeah, it's still too soon, right?
Yeah.
To change the map. Yeah, well, now I'm thinking what I really want is some astronomer to take it to the next level, and based on your galactic map, tell me what the constellations look like from, I don't know, you'd have to pick a planet, right? You can't do it on Coruscant, probably can't see the sky, but on Adatin or whatever, what are your constellations? So, yeah.
Wow, that'd be pretty cool.
Yeah, keep going deeper here. Well, as we wrap up and don't get too deep into all of this, even though obviously James and I and Jason could, why don't you tell us about your favorite Star Wars character?
Ooh,
and it can be yourself, I suppose.
Yeah, it's unnamed Hyperscout number 2. No, I was always a Han Solo kid. It was kind of funny when Lucasfilm approached me for Journey to the Force Awakens with the basic outline of the book that became Weapon of a Jedi, which is, Luke's first lightsaber duel. And it's really all about Luke kind of finding his way in the Force. And I said yes, because, of course I said yes. I wanted to write this Star Wars book. But I was actually, in my head, I was kind of sad because I really wanted to write the Han book. After the original Star Wars, I thought Luke should have gone off and been a space pirate with Han. Like, why do you want to hang around and be a soldier and take orders? It's like totally boring.
Oh, yeah.
But I didn't say anything because I wanted to write the book. And I wound up really glad about that because I wrote a Luke book and wound up appreciating the character and, really digging into the Force. And it was great fun. But I was telling this story at New York Comic Con next to Greg Rucka, the wonderful writer who had written the Han book in that series. And he looked at me and he said, he has this wonderful voice. He goes, "That's so funny because as a kid, I was a Luke kid and I didn't get Han." And I was like, why can't I write the Luke book? And he and I kind of looked at each other, but Mike Siglain of Lucasfilm was the moderator, and he looked at us in disbelief. And he was like, "Why didn't you two idiots say something?" But we did the same thing. We were like, maybe they'd get somebody else. It's a very long way of saying it's Han Solo.
That's so funny.
So if they offered you a book that wasn't Han, would you say, "No, I want to write the Han one"? Talk to Greg Rucka about this.
The amazing thing is one of my kind of bucket list books is a Han novel that I've thought about quite a bit, and actually goes back to stuff I played with writing as like a 14-year-old kid. So hey, maybe someday. Plus, I want to write a Jabba the Hutt, talented Mr. Ripley style book where Jabba is the protagonist, but you have to realize like he's doing horrible things and you shouldn't be rooting for him. Maybe someday.
I like that. I would read that.
Yeah, there we go.
Absolutely. Oh, that's delightful.
Well, if somebody wanted to go into fictional cartography, how would they do it?
Fictional cartography. Just have fun with it. I mean, that's the biggest thing is, what I always loved about that idea was it was another way to play with worlds that you really loved. I mean, once again, I started with Middle Earth, and that wound up being like a crash course in geology and climatology and continental drift and everything else. Like, the rabbit hole gets really, really deep. And, as a kid, I also parlayed that into D&D. Like, as a cartography kid, I wanted my fantasy world with all the usual obvious fantasy nonsense that every 13-year-old kid thought about, but I wanted it to feel like a real place. And I learned a lot about like, how rivers work and where mountain ranges go and things like that. And, that was enormous fun. You don't realize you're signing up for like hundreds and hundreds of hours of reading and self-education, but once you're on the other side of it, you're really grateful it happened. And, cartography in Star Wars was the same way, both engaging with other stories and, figuring out how galaxies work well enough to kind of fairly represent them in fiction. So, yeah, I mean, if something like that moves you, go for it. I mean, it can lead to some amazing places. Yeah. I think fictional cartography is such a niche that Everyone I've ever met who is also into it, I'm like, you're one of us. Like, come on in, the water's great.
Right. Perfect. Maybe start with something a little less complicated than Star Wars, though. Something with just one system, you know. Well, this was really awesome.
Thank you so much for letting me be a part of it. It was enormous fun for me, too.
Where can people find you online?
Find me on Blue Sky. You'll find me. I'm fairly easy to find. And if, God forbid, you find a cartographic error, not that I believe that's possible, in the galaxy far, far away, you can send it to essential.atlas@gmail.com. I do check it, and then we'll take it into account.
If you're looking for Jason Fry on Blue Sky, he's at Jason C. Fry.
There we go.
Okay. We'll put a link in the show notes, too. And I love that you have an outlet for point out our errors, at Gmail. So, that's great. Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing all this with us.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Yep. Good to see you, Jason. That wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We want to thank our guest, Jason Fry, and we want to thank all of you for listening.
We've got a lot of links in our show notes this time around, so check that out. It's available at skywalkingthroughneverland.com/star-warsologies. And also check out our YouTube channel, where we post some episodes with related visuals from Star Wars.
If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Instagram and Blue Sky, or at starwarsologies@gmail.com. No topic is off limits. Even if they made a new musician character for the Ahsoka series, would it be better than Ezra?
Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service and share it with your friends. And join us on Facebook. We have a group there called Star Warsologies Podcast Fan Group.
And my first book, Star Wars Crossword Puzzles and Other Word Games from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, is out from Chronicle Books and is available at your local bookstore or on online booksellers like bookshop.org or Amazon and Barnes & Noble.
We're part of the Skywalking Network, where you can find a variety of other great shows on Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, including Talking Apes and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. There's also a YouTube show called Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com.
See you next time on Star Warsologies.